Let's create a collage inspired by Romare Bearden. There are lots of different things you can use to make collage papers, including paint and a large paintbrush or foam brushes, and then lots of other things that you can find just around your space that are good for making marks. Corks are terrific for this. You can also make marks with a fork or cardboard or packing peanuts. I really like to use craft foam because I can then take some scissors and I can cut different pieces out to get thick lines and thin lines and different kinds of marks that I might want to make. That's a really great way to do that. It's really easy, and the thicker craft foam works best for this. Another great material that's really fun is, of course, a bubble wrap. Just be careful not to pop the bubbles. And then you might find a tempera paint stick to be useful. Let's practice making some of these marks. So first, how do we make these marks here on this paper? So this was made using cardboard that was just dipped into paint and then stamped onto the paper. Next, let's look at this paper, and this, as you might guess, was made by stamping with the bubble wrap. So to get the paint onto the bubble wrap, you can use a paintbrush or a foam brush and just take that and then dip it into the paint and then paint onto the bubble wrap. It's the least messy way to do this, and then you just stamp onto the paper with that painted bubble wrap. You can also clean off and wash and reuse bubble wrap more than once. Another fun painting tool is to use a plastic fork, and the plastic fork can be dipped into paint and then scraped across the paper to make some interesting marks. A flat paintbrush can also make some interesting marks, especially if you're using a dry brush technique, which means that your brush is not wet, it hasn't been dipped into water, and you dip it into the paint and then apply that paint to the paper, but do so in a way that makes scratchy looking marks. Packing peanuts come in interesting shapes and sizes and make a great painting tool. So you can take a paintbrush and paint onto the packing peanut and then use that to stamp onto your paper. Or if you have a clothespin, you can clip that onto your packing peanut and then dip it into the paint to make your mark. But keep in mind, if you're dipping it into the paint, you might end up with a bigger blob of paint on your paper. Now let's say you have a piece of paper that you've used a hole punch on. Well, this paper makes a great stencil, and if you apply paint on top of it using a foam brush, or even you could use your paint stick, when you apply that color and pull the paper away, the paper underneath will now have a nice dot pattern. Speaking about tempera paint sticks, they are a great alternative to liquid paint if you want to save time and use it to create a bottom layer of color before applying paint or any kind of pattern on top of it. This is because tempera paint sticks typically dry in less than 90 seconds. So once you've applied your color with your paint stick, you can go almost right away back to add a second layer. While our top layer of liquid paint is wet, we can then use a piece of our foam that we've cut little notches into to drag through that paint, and as we drag it through, you'll see that it pulls away some of the color, and you can see that the tempera paint stick is now visible through it. You'll want to experiment with this technique on different backgrounds because sometimes when you use certain colors of paint, it doesn't work as well or the effect is a little bit more subtle. Now let's look at some tools that we can find or use to make stamp marks. A cork is a great example of this. It makes some really wonderful circle shapes if you dip it into the paint and then apply that to your paper, but you can probably look around your area and find all kinds of other items that make interesting marks. Take a look at different things that might create patterns or textures and try those out in your own work. Although not mentioned earlier, a toothbrush is a great tool to have for making some paint splatter marks on your paper. So what you would do is you would just dip the bristles of the toothbrush into your paint, and then you can use your finger, or even better, to be a little less messy, another tool like a plastic utensil to try to flick the paint off of the bristles onto your paper. Depending on how much paint you have or how liquidy the paint is, you'll get smaller flecks of paint or bigger blobs of paint. Just make sure to protect your work area when you're doing this. You can also paint directly with your toothbrush bristles right onto your paper, and you'll get some interesting marks by doing it this way as well. If you happen to have a sponge brush that you're using, you can use it for more than just applying paint as a regular brush. You can use it as a stamping tool because the shape of the sponge brush can make a really interesting pattern when stamped onto your paper. Using rectangular or square tracers can help give a more uniform size to the different buildings that you may use in creating a cityscape. And if everyone is using the same tracers, then all of the works when they're displayed will look like they have a continuous design. When you're using a tracer, you want to make sure that you line up the edge to the edge of your paper so that way you're not wasting any paper and it's a little bit easier to determine the sizing as you're tracing and cutting the different pieces. Larger sheets of paper will work good for larger tracers, and of course smaller sheets of paper for smaller tracers. If you're using full sheets when you're making your projects, then you're going to want to line them up on the edge and trace around them. If you're using scrap papers, you want to make sure that the piece of paper you have is big enough, otherwise you can save it for details later. As you're cutting out your rectangles and squares for your buildings, just position them on your base paper, and you don't need to glue anything down yet. You just want to try to experiment with the placement and figure out what exactly you want to do for how many buildings you might want to have, if they're overlapping, how tall they are, if they're shorter buildings, and just play around with that. You can cut up lots of different papers, and you can always take things out later on. Once you've figured out what you're going to use for your buildings, it's time to think about your background space. So there is going to be space that goes above or below the buildings, and you want to make sure to address that before you get to gluing the buildings down. So for the bottom, the base of it, you might want to have a road or a sidewalk or a grassy area. You want to cut out a piece of paper to put on that. And you might find that using the base paper as a ruler or measuring tool is helpful for you to get a straight edge. So go ahead and do that if that is what works for you, or come up with your own technique. You'll want to do the same thing near the top of your base paper to represent the sky that might be peeking through. You can use a solid color or a patterned paper that you've painted, but go ahead and do that as well and make sure that you have it to the size of your paper. Trim it if you need to. Reposition some of the papers you cut for buildings and consider if they need to be made shorter, or if you want to add a roof or anything to the top of the building that might include an antenna or a satellite dish, or even just some detailing or a chimney. So consider that when you're looking at how tall your building is, because you want to make sure that the building doesn't go off the paper, so you might have to make your building shorter to accommodate any of those details. As you're placing your papers back on, you might realize that you want fewer buildings, and that's totally fine too. So as you're doing that, just keep in mind that this is a ever-evolving process where you are figuring things out as you go. If you are feeling very confident in some of your elements like your sky or your ground, you can go ahead and start applying glue. So when you're using the glue, you want to make sure the whole paper is covered. You can spread that glue with your finger, but if you don't like the feel of the glue on your finger, a sponge brush works great. You can also use a cotton swab. So you want to spread that out so the entire back area of the paper is covered in a thin layer of glue. You don't want it to ooze out around the sides if you can help it, so a thin layer works best. You have one of your buildings glued down, you might want to start adding some more details to that building before gluing other parts. So details would include things like windows or doors. You could have window frames, doorbells, stairs, so many different things. So when you're trying to cut multiple pieces of paper that are the same size, a good trick is to fold that paper. So the more folds you make, the more pieces you'll get, and then you can cut out your pieces and they'll all be the same size. This is perfect to do when you want all your windows to be the same. In a cityscape, you may want to add some type of signage to your building. A lot of times in the city, buildings might have a business or store on the bottom level and then apartments on the upper level, so you will need a sign to tell people what kind of business is in your building. As you're arranging and gluing down things that you want to be in an even row, you might want to find a way to make sure that they all stay at the same height. You can use a tracer or another piece of paper to help you as a measuring guide to make sure everything lines up. Or you can try to do it freehand, and if it's a little bit uneven, that's okay. You're adding a second building, you might find that you need to trim it to make it a little bit shorter because you want it to look different than the building you already have. Having differences in your work makes it more interesting. Keep this in mind when you're adding details like the roof or other things to this building so that it doesn't look exactly like the one that you already have glued down. If you've glued down your second building higher up on the paper, that gives the impression that it can be further behind your first building, or that it's just raised up higher, in which case you might want to add stairs so that people can access that building. When you're making the stairs, keep in mind that steps that are closer to the viewer should be larger, and those that are further away, closer to the building, should be smaller. So if you start with a larger rectangle for the bottom of the first step, the step above that will be a shorter rectangle, and that makes it look like it is receding in space, and it gives you the impression of depth in your artwork. Once you've glued down your two buildings, you might realize that you don't want to put a third building in your design, in which case you have this big empty white space in the middle of your paper, but you've already glued things down so you can't put paper behind it. Now is where you need to get a little bit more inventive and figure out how to cut paper to fit in between these two buildings because you don't want to have that white space. So you could actually expand the ground by adding more black paper. You could add a building that's sort of in the background by cutting some of your patterned or colored paper and fitting it in there. But you want to be able to fill in that white space as best as you can, and that can be a little tricky. So you might have to do your very best to measure it and cut out pieces of paper to fill in those gaps. Once you have all of the big elements of your design in place, think of what other details you could add, especially if you can do those with some of the smaller pieces of paper. Things like fences or additional details around doors or windows or doorknobs are all really great ways to use up smaller pieces of paper. Really small details can also be added with some drawing materials, so consider using things like markers or crayons or colored pencils to go back into your artwork and then add in details around your windows or doors. You can even use the markers or crayons to add things like maybe wires or street wires. You can use them as well to add things like numbers or words to your work. Or if you have in the next step cut out some pieces from magazines to use for those details like numbers and words, then you don't have to write them out with markers or crayons. It's okay to switch between using the dry materials and the collage materials. You may start by making some details with the dry materials and then realize that you want to add some more collage materials on top or in addition to those dry materials. Sometimes it makes sense for the dry materials to be underneath with a layer of collage materials on top. As you keep working, you might see that you've missed a few details that you'd like to add, so you can keep going back and forth between these two things until you feel like your work is complete. Earlier, I mentioned using cut-up magazines to add details to your artwork, and magazines can be a great way to find numbers. So if you want to add numbers to your building, you can use cut-out numbers from magazines and add those to show what the numbers are for the different buildings on your street. You can also find pictures of people that you can put inside the windows or inside the doors. You can find words that might be standing in for names of businesses. In this example, we have something that says wash it out, and that could be a laundromat. So there are all kinds of things that you can find in magazines to add details to your collage. There is really no specific order in which you might want to use materials depending on what your idea is. So follow your idea, follow your inspiration. You could use collage materials that you get from a magazine and then go back to using dry materials and then go back to using cut paper, the colored patterns or just solid colors, and use those in your artwork. Do whatever it is that you feel inspired to do to make your vision for your work complete. In this finished collage, we have two buildings. One of them has two businesses in it, and the other one is an apartment building, and then behind that is a car shop. In another collage, we have images that show people in the windows or going in the doors, and these are very different, but you can see that as they're displayed together, because they have very similar sized buildings, it gives a cohesive idea that this is a city scene.